Alright, hello again to anyone watching these Kaijudo videos, and welcome to the final video of my Eye of the Storm Kaijudo set review. So today I'm going to be covering the 5 super rares. I'm also going to show off a few decks that I've built using some of these super rares, and then I will do sort of a top 10 list of what I think are probably amongst the best cards in the set at the very least, and also some of my favorite cards in the set. So a little bit of a balance between those two things. So I'll do both of these things in these videos. So the first card here, Justicar Arcanix. So a 6 mana Mecha Thunder, 6,000 power, double breaker, blocker, important to note, and you can tap 2 fewer mana to cast spells, but it can't go below 1. And then all the spells in your shield zone have shield blast. So a ton going on here. Definitely a build around. Like, you want to be playing a bunch of spells so you can make use of the extra mana. You want to have maybe ideally a big suite of expensive spells that you can get out with shield blast that are really important, like having shield blast absolute darknesses and absolute incinerations. Like, those can be really powerful cards to have down in shields when you set up with Arcanix. Obviously, maybe the downside to that is if you're trying to set up your shields and your opponent just removes Justicar Arcanix, you don't get a lot of value out of that. But it just pairs so well with those effects because you can curve Justicar Arcanix into absolute darkness as well. So you don't need it in shields. Like, you can just cheapen those huge AoE effects, which are really hard to come by in this game. So I think it's really powerful there with those kinds of spells. You can also cheapen spells, so like Crystal Memory becomes absurd because you can play 2 mana Crystal Memory, which is so much better. And then if you're searching out spells, those are reduced as well. So you can basically just cast a Terrapit from your deck at 7 mana if you want to, if you need that effect. So it's just a super nice effect. It's also a double, like the blocker tag is really nice too because it can stabilize the board. Kind of annoying that it makes it weak to cards like Comet Missile or even any of those kinds of effects. That maybe is kind of a downside, but at the same time, like blocker is probably at the end of the day a more beneficial effect than not having it when you're playing against Rush, especially if you're going to overload their blocker removal with Striders and other things like that. Like Justicar Arcanix, like being a blocker, is just a nice way to hedge against like some of the aggro decks. Although 6,000 power isn't even the biggest blocker in the face of giant evolution creatures. So the card, just tons of text on it. So I want to show off a few of the decks I've played with it. So a couple of them here. So the first build I have is just like kind of just a light water dark spell-based control deck. So I have Iron Will Trees and Aqua Striders, Stingwings as early blockers. I've got Logos Curator as well from the set, which pairs well with having a bunch of spells like Mesmerize and Logo Scan. And then I have like Sparkcade is another cheap spell that pairs well with the Skirmish blockers, turns on Logos Curator as well, draws cards. Really cool effect to have with Arcanix as well, just as a 1 mana spell. It's really potent. Chronarch here to set up our shields. This could probably be Cyberlord Corel. The more I've played, I wanted to play around with Chronarch when I was building this archetype as well, and I originally tried like 3 copies to try to really make use of it as like a value engine. And the Chronarch is just not a good card, unfortunately. Like, it just rarely works, always ending up in my mana zone. I decided to keep one still, but this card should probably be Corel, if anything, or just like a better card in general. If I want the shield manipulation effect, yeah, Corel is just better in my opinion. Cetus is really cool too. Just make use of these bodies. Just a great card. This card can also set up your shields in a way where, like, if you see a giant spell, you can put that down, or you can draw it to use. Just a great card in general. Mesmerize, Logo Scan, Crystal Memory, great spells. Bone Blades, Terrapit, Piercing. Just a lot of straightforward. This is mostly just like a good stuff deck. Not really leaning too hard in synergies outside of just like the triple Absolute Darkness and Radiant Purification. This card's Radiant Purification is an amazing shield blast if you can get that off of Arcanix, but Absolute Darkness is a card you can cast on curve off of Arcanix, which is pretty important in my view. So I thought this build just like obviously a little bit underpowered when you consider we're not playing like any of the busted stuff like Haven, Lyra, Andromeda. So this is the kind of deck in like a post-banless world. Like, maybe this sort of much more like low to the ground kind of control deck could be a lot more playable and a lot cooler. But this is like one of the approaches I had. The other approach I had to the Justicar deck was this version here, which was a lot more combo heavy. So this is just deck is doing a ton of different stuff. This one a little less refined than the previous list. So the other card I really wanted to build around was Crotork. So I mean, I could probably be playing 3 copies of Crotork, to be honest. It's both a fire mana and just like a build around card here to use. But the idea of this deck was like just use these 2 cards in combination. Like you can start double Crystal Memorying. You have Gargle Visions, which pair a little better with Crotork than they do with Arcanix, but you have Recharge, which is awesome too. Like if you're copying it with Crotork, it's really powerful. If you're using it with Arcanix, it's just super cheap, which makes it a lot easier to use. We have Laser Eyes as on-curve removal to pair with Curator, as opposed to something like Mesmerize. This one as well I was trying out the Chronarch as well. Like I had the mix of Coral this time and the Chronarch, but yeah, this card probably wouldn't make the final cut. Mystic of Water can search out some of these water spells, search out Reverberate. Of course, I have Absolute Incineration as opposed to Absolute Darkness. Still have the one of Radiant Purification. The Jump Jets looks weird, but the idea with this was I wanted like a kind of pseudo combo element. Like this deck is doing a ton of different stuff. Like this deck is a bit of a joke, but like I figured like in games where like I'm just turboing through my deck, like if I'm playing like 1 mana logo scans and drawing 4 cards, I can just turbo through Crystal Memory for multiple cards, Gargle Visions for 2. Like I can just do a ton of stuff, draw a bunch of cards, play multiple free Aeronaut Glirgles, and then I could just play Jump Jets, copy it with Crotork, and get like double fast attacking Aeronauts. So that's kind of what I was like aiming to do with that. Definitely a little bit of a joke, but I felt like this deck was doing a little bit more cool stuff than the previous version, but this version is probably doing a little bit too much. Again, like these Chronarchs should probably be cut for Coral, so better bait for Crotork. Maybe I could play like a few more cheap water creatures to facilitate Crotork as well. I don't know. Definitely would have to trim the numbers on a lot of this stuff. I was trying both Spark Cage, which is a lot worse in this version without like multiple skirmish blockers. I was trying the Thought Collective just as another way to, just like an extra copy of Logoscan that can dig for these combo, because this is like a more of a build around deck. It was a nice on-curve way to play into Curator while also digging kind of like a pseudo Crystal Memory. So this deck doing a lot more, but yeah, some cool ways to build around Justicar. So yeah, overall the card's like pretty powerful. It has like the classic problem where you're trying to untap with this card to really utilize it well. And in the face of so many cards like Piercing and what's it called? Piercing and Rusalka and Finbar, it's kind of hard to keep this card in play. The benefit to this is like you can get value out of it in the sense that like you can get some mana reduction. Like you can play this plus Logoscan in the same turn on turn 7. So that's kind of nice. So you can get some reduction. But the blast effect like is one of the other powerful things to do as well. So if your opponent ever doesn't have an answer, or if they just try to Lyra this, like it's not really weak to that kind of effect. Like Lyra and Psychic Predator against this, like you can just keep it in play, and then the Shield Blast is super threatening against their position. So a lot going for it. Like if they can't outright just bounce it to your hand, like it's going to be incredibly threatening on the battle zone. But yeah, it's not like it's not necessarily like a tap out and do nothing. Like you don't have to untap with it to for it to accomplish things, just because, or I mean you do, sorry, but like it sort of does things the turn it enters the battle zone. Like it still affects the board. Like that's what more of the direction I want to go with it is. Like when you tap out for like a combo piece card like this card affects the board because it's a blocker and it threatens this Shield Blast. So it's not like, oh, I'm playing my combo piece hoping I don't die and then I gotta untap and combo. Like it still affects the board as a big blocker, and making your shield zone super live with these absolute effects and like at least the threat of that makes it really difficult for you to like lose the game when you tap out for this if they can't remove it. So then you do get to untap with it and you do get to use this spell effect. So that's sort of more what I was trying to illustrate there. But definitely a powerful card. So the next one here is Renegade Hero Finbar, which is another huge build around. So this is a blocker, 5 mana, 4,000. Summon a creature with guard, you draw a card, and all your creatures that have guard can attack as though they didn't have that ability. And it has just a ton of words on this one too. At the end of each of your turns, look at the top 3, and you can put one of them on top, put the rest on the bottom. So you can just sort of set up your draw for the following turn. Like just go through a ton of different cards. So just completely churn through your deck, look for combo pieces, or look for whatever you want. This gives redundancy to like the Panopter effect, or more so, it almost feels like Panopter gives you the redundancy on this effect, where you get multiple 5-drop creatures that can just draw cards. Obviously, you skew your deck way harder in the favor of guards, but you're less reliant on any effects like Sky Shark or what's the card? Rally the Reserves to actually do anything with your blockers. Like this card alone can draw cards and let them attack. So this card is super powerful. Of course, like it has to survive, but for you to do anything. But I think there's a lot going for this card. So some of the builds that I had with this, or the one build, I had built this Lightwater Nature blocker deck. Again, this is very unrefined, but the idea here was just like you fill the deck primarily with guard blockers like Cyber Sprite, Aqua Initiate, Waterway Watcher, like all the 1-drops that are pretty obvious. And then you can round it out with some of the good skirmish blockers as well, like Lemon or Chasm Entangler and Ironwill Tree. And then you have Hovercraft Glurgle, which lets you just block indefinitely or not indefinitely, like you can just infinitely block with all these creatures unless your opponent finds a way to remove the Hovercraft. You can also use Nurturing Hive. Nurturing Hive was a card I tested at 3 when in my initial build of this, as like a nature mana and like a good card to pair with them, so you can just play all your 1-drops for free. But as I played more with the deck, I realized like this card just wasn't necessary. Like it was totally fine to just like this card is nice for the nut draw of like going Nurturing Hive into Panopter into play a bunch of 1-drops that same turn. But it was just fine enough for me to play like Panopter and then maybe wait till turn 6 and then play Panopter and play 1-drop at the same time, or maybe not even wait till turn 6, but just play Panopter and then just untap and play a bunch of blockers and draw cards. So it's nice to curve with Nurturing Hive so that you can get that effect right away, but I just found like this card just wasn't necessary in my testing. I Spy was like a skirmish blocker that can dig for everything, so there's a fair amount of skirmish blockers in here, which might be weird. Like I only have the one Sky Shark to attack with them, but for the most part, like it felt like enough when I was playing the deck. Like the skirmish blockers just reward the Panopter side of things, which is still good enough, and then the guard blockers all reward the Finbar, and you don't need infinite attackers. Like if you're just churning through your deck and putting out like a pile of blockers, like if half of them can attack, that's good enough, because if you have like 10 blockers in play and 5 of them are attackers, like that's totally reasonable. Especially when you can evolve the light blockers into stuff like Magistrate Dejuri, which is really cool because it lets you make a big push on their shields and then untap all your guys afterwards. So like I thought that was really cool, like even if you hit like a Storm Spark effect or something like that. So carrying on, I mean like Finbar, like that, yeah, the heart of the deck. You have, I just felt like just Storm Spark and Containment Field just to like guarantee you could get untapped. So like if you make a push on their shields and then they counter push you, like you have all these effects that tap their whole team, so you can make the final push after that. Crystal Memory, maybe unnecessary, but it searches up the pieces. Might be better to just play like a leaner deck and just forgo memory. But the final card here was Swift Regeneration, which may be a little bit too cute, maybe unnecessary. Part of why I have all these like lemons and blue wardens, and I'm still playing the one Nurturing Hive just as like an extra nature mana, was I wanted to play Regeneration, just because having like an invincible board of like blockers just seemed really cool. Also, like when you have Finbar, you can just play Regeneration, summon out a bunch of blockers and draw a bunch of cards. On top of that, you can also protect your Finbar. So like if your opponent's just playing a removal heavy deck and they're just going to kill every Finbar that you see, what you can do is like you can make really cool plays where you have your Finbars and you keep your Finbars in your mana zone, then you land a Swift Regeneration, summon out the Finbar as like an indestructible creature, alongside maybe even some blockers, draw cards immediately, and then you can set it up such that like the next turn you can untap with like a big field and then kill them that turn because like all your creatures are indestructible. So that's really sweet. The other play that this card is really cool with is like you can summon out Magistrate Jazuri, maybe even on top of a Chasm Entangler, and then you can just attack with the Magistrate Jazuri, unleash, and then untap all the creatures that attack. So you can make multiple like minor pushes at the same time. Like you can just attack, have a bunch of indestructible blockers, and then kill them the following turn after that. If you like, it gives you a lot of security in case you hit something like a Stormspark Blast or a bunch of Shield Blast like Arbiter or something like that. Like you can just, it gives you insulation so you don't just die if you go for game. So maybe a bit of overkill. Like maybe it's just better to have a very lean like light water version of this kind of deck. Maybe it's good enough to just have a Jazuri. Like you still play the few skirmish blockers to pair with Jazuri, and like I Spy's great at digging for both Panopter and Finbar, and like Panopter still works just as well with the skirmish blockers, and like you can play Sky Shark to let those attack. Sky Shark's also another card too. Like Swift Regeneration just lets you throw down this Sky Shark early, and then if you have a field full of skirmish stuff, you can summon it out. So this deck might also be doing too much. Could use some refining, but I felt like it was a cool idea, and it's been decent in my play testing with it. So another cool idea there, and definitely just a really strong build around. Like digging through your deck is just also so crazy because you can just, like, that's part of why I like the Swift Regenerations, was you just dig through your deck and you can just have the security behind this huge wall of blockers, and then just find like the Jazuri or find the Sky Shark or find that Swift Regeneration to just like put all your plays together and just go over the top of your opponent. So next card here is Vang, the Restless Plague, which, unlike the previous two cards, this is just like a standalone just bomb of a threat. Like 6 mana 6k double breaker. When it enters a battle zone and whenever it attacks as well, which is kind of insane. Like target enemy creature gets minus 3000 and then until the end of the turn, and then you can clash with your opponent, and if you won the clash, each enemy creature gets minus 1000 power until the end of the turn. So this is not the kind of clash card that is like has a lot of variance to it in terms of like whether it's good or not. This one is just like a beast of a card, and then it's more so like your opponent might get incredibly unlucky when you like hit the clash every time. Like if you like target a Finbar and then you hit the clash and kill the Finbar, or like it's just kind of absurd. Like if you can stack for Vangs even, like that seems like insane as well. Like if you play a Vang and then next turn you attack with a Vang, and then after playing a second Vang, like this card just gets disgusting where like it stacks with itself to where like you can kill 6Ks. Like the play this has with Grand Manipulator Agrics as well is just like a darkness card to summon out of your graveyard. Like this card is like, I don't know where this stacks up against like things like Lyra and Finbar, but it's definitely in that conversation of just these like standalone incredibly powerful 6-drops. Of course, like Lyra does a great job answering evolutions. Finbar can answer like anything while also like advancing your board state and letting you draw a bunch of cards, so it just buries your opponent, which is why it's so powerful. It's like good in any spot almost. Vang mostly answers small creatures, but it just seems like it does it in like an incredibly powerful way. And like having that built-in effect to like just randomly spike killing all your opponent's cyber scamps, like this card just seems like awesome. I don't know where it would slot in. Like maybe it's more of a mid-range card. Maybe it's not like a good enough control tool. Like you'd probably still play it as like a 1 or 2 of in pile control, I'd imagine. Like it would be a nice card to Crystal Memory for. Lyra's a bit more of a catch-all, is a bit more rounded of a card, I think, in terms of what it answers. But I mean, this card can still come down against a dragon deck, pick off a bird, and then maybe even kill both birds. Like it'd be interesting to note, like if you're staring down Lux and Nyx, would you just target the Lux and then take like the maybe 50% or greater if you're playing the pile, like 50 to 60% chance of like winning the clash to kill the Nyx? Or would you just outright kill the Nyx because it's a more threatening card? You probably just kill the... That's a tough call. I actually wonder what like the right play is. So if anyone has insight on that, I feel like it would probably be best to just go for that. Like if you're a 60%, like killing Lux, like Nyx is a much better card than Lux, just because if they get the draw out of it, it can be kind of annoying. But like assuming you have Vang in play, like you're already in a decent position, so you should probably just take like the... Like they can't even do anything with the card they get off Nyx that turn because like they're just playing a dragon, drawing a card for next turn. Like I feel like it's just worth like killing the Lux and then like 60% of a Nyx as well. Like you'd probably just make that play. But interesting to think about for sure. I guess it would be a little bit depending on the situation, how valuable Lux is or how valuable Nyx might be, but just an awesome card. Just great against dragons. Like you pick off a bird and then the 6-drop in play, like also just like it. You can just address Herald so well. Like if they try to tap it down with Lyra, then you can follow up with your own Lyra. Like this card seems awesome. So I would definitely play it like 1 to 2 of. I don't know if it would be like the snap 3 of like Lyra is, just again because it doesn't deal as effectively with evolution creatures, but even still, like there are tons of decks like Mono Nature even will put out a bunch of small creatures sometimes, and this card can still attack over an Anjak if it needs to. So yeah, awesome card. I think this card is really, really strong. Shakathar, the Void Reacher. Void Spawn, Armor Dragon, fast attack, and whenever this creature attacks, you may clash with your opponent. If you win, put a non-evolution Void Spawn from your hand into the battle zone. So this card, maybe there was more Void Spawn coming down the line, but there just aren't really any exciting ones that I can think of that I would want to put into play. Like the best Void Spawn is Vang, but that card's just so good. Like I would just cast this on turn 6. Like I don't need to play Shagathar, win a clash to put a second Vang into play. Like this card just doesn't seem that cool to me. Not really something I'm interested in. Yeah, I don't really get it. Like 7 mana is just too much. Like to where like this is always like almost always going to be like the last card in your hand. I don't know if there ever ended up being any creatures that were like every creature type or something, like just like any giant Void Spawns too. Like this card would be interesting, especially because it's like fast attack, so your opponent doesn't even have like the ability to interact with it particularly well. So if there were some crazy synergies, this card would be just like a standalone awesome card. They would only have really discard to interact with it. But with the current card pool, this card just seems pretty bad. And the last super rare is Ultimate Tatsurian. So 8 mana, 24,000 power, just actually absurd stat line. World Breaker, so it breaks every single one of your opponent's shields. And it evolves on Fire Nature. When it enters the battle zone, each of your other creatures can't be blocked while attacking creatures and can attack untapped creatures as though they were tapped. So super weird effect. So like it lets all your dudes attack their dudes unimpeded. So if you have a board full of giant creatures, like you can just make a mess of their board, but it itself can't attack untapped creatures. So it's not like it can be just like a giant terror pit for their Eternal Haven or whatever. Like it can't just come down and kill the Haven. It has to, like, so weird. So weird. Like the problem with this is like, again, like it swallows up your board, like it swallows up your board state as a vortex. It fits, like you want to be playing a bunch of creatures with it, at which point like you're diminishing the effect of World Break, because it's effectively going to be like, if you're playing an aggressive or like mid-rangey style deck, you're going to put them lower on shields, and then maybe they're at like 2 or 3 shields, at which case like this card is like just a double or triple breaker, and then so it feels like you're in like intentionally not attacking in the hopes of like you land this Ultimate Tatsurian to like World Break, which is like kind of an interesting play pattern. It lets you like take control of the board state without having to like risk that board state by breaking shields and hitting shield blasts early. But so like you could take that line of play instead if you're playing towards Ultimate Tatsurian. But for the most part, I just think this card's like worse than Boulder Fist. Like Boulder Fist, you can afford to get aggressive, win the games where you don't draw the Ultimate Tatsurian because you are playing an aggressive style, and then Boulder Fist can also just be, or like, where, yeah, like if you're playing, and then like Boulder Fist could also just be like a mass removal at the top end. Like it just clears out all their blockers. Ultimate Tatsurian can't do anything about blockers, so you just play it and you want a World Break, and it just gets chump blocked by like a Full Metal Lemon, and then you're just like, okay, well, I mean, I guess part of the thing is if you have a big enough board, like your creatures can attack their blockers to clear the way for Ultimate Tatsurian a World Break, but you're talking about like both people or like you having like just a massive board. I just like don't see the games where this card really does everything it really sets out to do. Like it's a little bit too weak to blockers. It's a little bit too conditional on having like a big board, or to like kill your opponent the same turn it attacks. I mean, it's definitely powerful. Like 24k demands like a Terror Pit or like it's or like a Slayer or something, or it's like impossible to deal with. And then just breaking all your opponent's shields if they don't have a blocker in play. Like they have to play around it a lot of the time, but it feels like the play patterns would just like not go in its favor. Like the classic like multi-civ, vortex evolution, all these weird things going on. Like I just feel like it would never line up as well as you would want it to, but it's definitely a super powerful card. Maybe I'm underestimating like how cool, like good it could be in just like a straight up mid-range deck. Like again, like giving you the ability to take that passive role while having this like giant finisher. But I just don't like that approach. Like I'd rather just play like again like a mono nature style deck, or like maybe I do play fire, but I'm just playing like a more mid-rangey attacking game. I can win all the games I don't draw Tatsurian because I just am beating face with my other evolutions like Anjak or whatever else. And then like I'd much rather have like Boulder Fist at the top end. Like I said, like it can clear out my opponent's creatures to stabilize the board, or it can clear out my opponent's blockers to go for game. 8 mana is also a lot for that kind of deck to play towards if you're not playing heavy ramp, at which point like it's kind of hard to also like balance ramp and also going wide on the board to really make use of Ultimate Tatsurian well. Like Boulder Fist just requires one piece of bait, and like it basically world break. Like if you're playing an aggressive game and your opponent's at 3 shields, Boulder Fist is just as well like a world breaker as Ultimate Tatsurian is, and it requires a lot less setup. So I'm not a huge fan of this card, but definitely a lot of power here. Not sure what the best way to build around it is, but the one build I built was inspired by another player from the Discord, Kairik, who had built like a sort of a much more like controlling. It was like a really cool controlling version where it had crystal memory and it was putting together packages of like Mana Storm, and then it could play up to Absolute Incineration where it's just like blowing up your opponent's field. And then his deck was a much more, I think much more like it was a little bit more controlling, or a little more, I don't know, there was a lot more different stuff being played in his list. I felt like this version I built is a little more refined and a little more focused on just like playing to Tatsurian. His build had a lot more blockers, like water blockers. It had more defensive blasts, I think, as well. Like, or maybe not more, but like his had some extra cards in it. This card is just like a slim 40 card build. Not sure if this is the right way to approach it, but I really like the core of what his deck was doing, which was just like a water-based like kind of combo approach where you're just kind of like playing a control game, playing removal, playing creatures, and then you have like Tatsurian as this giant threat to like world break. So like you're really leveraging the world break effect of it. So the idea here is like you have a bunch of like you can play your ramp game of just like Sprout into Bronze Arm Tribe into Octuska into Ultimate Tatsurian, and then you can have like some residual creatures around. Maybe you can also just like take a turn off and then wait to like play Bodyguard plus Tatsurian in the same turn. This deck is super creature light, so I don't know if this is the right approach. Maybe it's a little bit more of a gimmicky version of the deck, but it can pull off like game plan pretty well. You have like Blazing Helix to deal with blockers if your opponent's trying to set those up. Absolute Incineration can also do that. You have Mana Storm, which maybe is unnecessary. Like it's really good with the Absolute Incineration to play towards that early, like just Sprout into Memory into Mana Storm into this is like a pretty nice curve. Giga Horn Charger is actually like a card that I should probably be playing more of, to be honest. Like just this floater creature that can search up this. Maybe I could play a little bit more of a developed package. Heal Flame was really nice for closing games once your opponent's on 0 shields. Logo Scan is just an extra card advantage piece for the early game to round the deck out. Rothis, Shield Blast creature. I should probably go back to playing Artichokes. I just didn't really have room for them in this variant. But, and like the nature was one of the more heavily, there were a lot more numbers to the nature count. So I was looking for fire cards like Waylay to round the deck out to give me more fire mana, and more water cards to round the deck out because like I was low on water mana, so I put in the Cyberwalker Kaylee's. I really like Artichoke as a creature blast. That's like a really good defensive blast in a number of matchups similar to Rothis, and is also just a body I can bring out to evolve on. So I really like that card. But I felt like Root Trap, the reason I put this card in instead was just because this deck really struggled with like larger evolution creatures and stuff like that, like doesn't really have a good answer to those. Like like Sumo Artichoke would just be more answers to small creatures. Waylay, again, only really here as like a fire mana. Could be just a better creature, to be honest. Like I could just find something better to play. Probably worth it. I just like this card because it's just a pet card of mine, and it's like a anti-creature removal tool, and like I felt like it was better than playing like a lot of the blockers. Like the water blockers you couldn't evolve on anyways, and Waylay I felt like was just a better card than those, because like rather than playing like a refi type card, I'd rather just reach out and kill the bird. I'd rather reach out and kill the Nyx, or kill the Jarbala hatchery, or like kill the 2-drop. Like this card is actually really, really powerful against Rush when you're going second. Just being able to kill their 2-drop before it can attack is like super strong. So I think this was like a pretty underplayed card in Kaijudo, or not necessarily underplayed, because I don't think like Fire decks should have seen play. So I don't like blame anyone for not playing this card, but I think this was a much more powerful card than it led on, based on how much play it actually ended up seeing in the game. Like it's a super strong removal tool. At only 2 mana. Like there's just not a lot of great 2 mana cards in the game, so Waylay is just awesome for that. But yeah, definitely a pet card. Could probably be up the creature count with this slot, but it would have to be a fire creature, so I'm not sure what the ideal thing for that would be. But this was like my first take. Like you have some anti-aggro stuff, some control tools, probably totally unnecessary. Like maybe it should be more creature heavy, less control heavy. If I'm going to go this kind of combo Tatsurian finisher route, maybe it's better to just not be a combo control deck and just be a combo deck. Because like I don't really like Ultimate Tatsurian in like the aggro decks, because it's just like I feel like it's just not being used as well there, and it's just better to just either not play the card at all, or if I am going to look for something like that, just play Boulder Fist instead, for a lot of the reasons I've outlined already. So I think I like going this combo approach because it's much more novel use, and it's more to the spirit of this giant world breaker when you go that way. And I think it's an actual way to leverage, like I could just play Ultimate Tatsurian as a bad version of Boulder Fist if I just really want to play Ultimate Tatsurian. Like I could just play a worse deck just to use the card. But I'd rather like build a deck really to the spirit that actually uses Ultimate Tatsurian as the card it's intended to be. And that's why I build my decks like this, because I just want to build it to the spirit of what the card is trying to accomplish. And so in doing that, I think it might be better to just go like full combo rather than combo control, because like I could just forgo these root traps, forgo Absolute Incineration, play Sumo Artichokes instead, play more like ramp creatures, maybe go that direction. But remains to be seen. Deserves a little more testing, but I really like the appeal to like the Crystal Memory Mana Storm. Like it just got my juices flowing when I was looking at that kind of interaction. Like having the 2 directions to play towards was really cool, but maybe it's doing both plans a little ineffectually. But I mean, at the same time, like Absolute Incineration buys you a bunch of time to land this Tatsurian, so at the end of the day, this deck is going to be just kind of underpowered compared to like the actual good decks in Kaijudo, which is kind of the problem, because that's what I was like, some of the decks I practiced this deck against was like, but I feel like this build especially, I think this is actually pretty competitive if you're looking at like competing with some lower tier archetypes. Like if you're looking at playing against tier 2, tier 3 decks, like this deck I think is right on par. Like it's a powerful deck. It can do it. Like while I was playing it, it definitely executed its game plan consistently. Like it could consistently present Tatsurian, find Tatsurian, world break, and put itself in a position to win. It's just like against the stiffest competition, it's just really hard to actually win games consistently, and a lot of decks can just deal with this Ultimate Tatsurian plan. So it's not really enough to win the game on its own. So I don't know. I think as a competitor at the tier 2 sphere, this deck is definitely there, but at the top tiers, I just don't think this card is really viable. So that covers the 5 super rares in the set. I think Ultimate Tatsurian, Justicar Arcanix, and Renegade Hero Finbar definitely build arounds. Shakathar a build around as well, but there just doesn't really exist in the card pool the cards for this. And then Vang is just standalone, just powerhouse. Could be played in control decks, could be played even in tempo decks, although I think it might be a little bit worse there than like just tempo than Lyra and Finbar are. But still, just an amazing card. Great with Agrix too. Like it's just a busted card. So this card could go in any deck and be fine. So with that said, I will go into my top 10 cards from the Eye of the Storm set. Of course, no top 10 list is good without a few honorable mentions. So I decided to, I will cover the three honorable mentions here are Flutterbug, Tinker Tipster, and Blade Spawn. All of these three cards are 2-drops that would probably see play in the open format. They're all just like minor upgrades to cards that already exist, which in Tinker Tipster's case, this upgrades like the 2-drop Cyberlord slot. Like if you ever wanted like a 7th or 8th, this card is probably better than Hypergrid Hacker, because like even if it doesn't work half the time, like a 2-mana 1000 power half the time plus like 2-mana 1000 power 2-mana 1000 power that sets a shield the other half of the time is like a much better card than like a lot of these other cards that have been are Cybergrid Bandit or whatever. Like that card, like straight up vanilla, has seen play. Hypergrid Hacker is like a decent card, but this card, like half of this card's effect going off is still like better than I think a lot of the other options. And then it could just be the case that like half of this card's effect going off, or this effect going off half the time, is still better than something like Cyber Trader. So this card could easily be an upgrade to a lot of these like water decks that already exist. Blade Spawn, just an easy upgrade to a lot of like the 2-drop slot in the mono fire rush decks. And Flutterbug, another really heavy consideration, an upgrade over any decks playing Ambush Scorpion, although I think those decks are probably be playing Pouncing Cricket instead. So I don't know if this cracks. I don't think if this is like enough better than maybe the other cards are, but Flutterbug is definitely a really strong Mega Bug consideration. I think I touched on this card too. I think it could be better for Mono Nature as a consideration than it is for Mega Bugs, just because like Mega Bugs has a lot of ways to get this kind of effect, removing blockers out of the way. Like you have Piercings and Homunculons and Rusalkas and Fimbars and Lyras. Like you have options, like even Blinder Beetle Prime if you want to play that kind of build. Like you have tons of options for interaction, whereas Mono Nature is much more just attack your opponent's face every turn and then maybe land a Boulder Fist at the top end to clear some blockers. So Flutterbug gives a lot more of a unique effect to that kind of archetype. So I think for that reason alone, like this card is more appealing because it does something more unique for mono nature, where it can, like, you can target an Anjak and that card then force your opponent to, or not allow your opponent to chump block with a Full Metal Lemon, which is a play pattern that comes up a fair amount in like the pile control matchup. So that could be a crucial interaction. And the 2-drop slot is like something I've been struggling to find, like the second play set of 2-drops. Like I've tried Savage Spawn, I've tried Pouncing Cricket, which I'm currently playing, but I have no idea what the optimal 2-drop is, and Flutterbug could be an easy consideration there. So all of these 2-drops, totally reasonable additions to the card pool, but none of them are going to be like exceptionally, like they're not Cyber Scamp or Aqua Strider. Like these aren't exceptionally more powerful than the other 2-drops that currently exist that could see play. So these cards would be like slam dunks in terms of like what are the most likely cards to see play in open decks. Like these three would all be at the top end of this set, but none of them are like insane actual increases in power level. I feel like the rest of the cards on this top 10 list are all going to be much more novel in the fact that like they create their own archetypes or they do things incredibly unique to themselves, which is not really the case with these like more marginal upgrades to existing cards. So that's why these guys are honorable mentions. So going into the top 10 list, it's not going to be ordered in any real particular way, but number 10 here, to be honest, this card is honestly, I don't know if I can really stand behind this as a top 10 card of the set. For me, this isn't one of the cards that's going to be in here based on power level. This is one of the more, like, this is just like an excitement pick for me. Like, this is a card I'd want to experiment the most with. Like, I talked a lot about how this card pairs with Ignis and how it could be really appealing to support an Arachnomech deck. Like, playing Arachnomech, bringing out Ignis, which summons this from your deck, like, that could be a really powerful interaction where you replace all the bait that went into the Arachnomech, and you have 4 fast attackers that turn, like, or 4, you can break 4 shields that turn. Like, it just seems really powerful. So this is a card I really want to experiment with, and this is basically just a printing of Ignis, because Ignis wasn't good enough before, in my mind, but Ignis is like a really cool card, and this card basically prints that card into the format. So I don't think this card is actually maybe at the top, at the tier of like other cards that could be on this list. I had foregone like a bunch of some of the other Vortex evolutions. Like Rammus isn't on this list. That card could easily be here. I don't think I even put Alcadius on this list, which might be kind of crazy because that card is like at 2 mana compared to all the other Vortex evolutions, is probably one of the most abusable and like powerful in terms of tempo swings, especially for like a defensive, like that card should probably be on this list. And if you're just talking straight power, even the Mammoth, like that card could be on here. I think that's one of the better Vortexes, just as like a giant creature that can kill your opponent's stuff and doesn't necessarily rely on your opponent having to have tap stuff. Like you can just clear their board state while breaking their shield. So like even if you hit a shield blast, that card is still, you're not in the worst position, because it's not like you hit a shield blast, you have no board position, and they still do. Like you're kind of both at square one. So the Mammoth is like decent, maybe at the lower end, but yeah. Valko, probably not going to make it in the long term in terms of overall power, but it's one of the cards I'm most excited to play with and experiment with. And if Ignis ends up being good, like this card would be a big part of that, and that could, and that would kind of make this card, maybe it does have the potential to surpass a lot of those like conditional vortexes and stuff like that. So I feel like it might be more likely in the long run that this card would see more play than the kind of mediocre vortexes, because a lot of those mediocre vortexes will belong to kind of mediocre decks. But if Ignis is good, it could belong to a good deck, maybe. I don't know. Maybe hard to say. Next card here, another card that's maybe not certain if it would see play. It's another kind of build around. I showed off that Justicar Arcanix deck earlier, and that's the kind of deck you might have to play. This card could also just slot into pile control, but I feel like those decks would have to rework themselves a little. Like this card would be an awesome card to play off Sprout on turn 3. So maybe it just does slot into pile control. It would give you an extra water mana, which is always something really needed. And this card could just help you develop your board presence. So I could see this card being pretty good. It could go into maybe not just like super dedicated spell decks, but you'd have to be somewhat dedicated. Like maybe the pile would have to play a few more copies of Logo Scan as well. Maybe this could support like just a light water dark pile. Like maybe you just don't have to play nature. You could play a more like controlling mid-rangey version, similar to the Arcanix deck I played, but rather than building around Arcanix, you could just play better cards like Andromeda and Haven and play like the complete kind of control game, or like the Kaijudo style control game. So I feel like this card has a lot of potential. Again, maybe like I feel like this has the higher likelihood to be better than a lot of these like build around vortexes like I just mentioned with Valko. Like I feel like this card is just, as a standalone card, is just could be better. But maybe it doesn't get there, and like those blatantly powerful vortexes are better inclusions for this list. But both of these cards are just two cards that I really enjoy the idea of. So the next card here, Marnick. This card's amazing. Like I've talked about it too. Like I'm not sure what decks it actually ends up in, just because Light Nature is like one of the most competitive civilizations to compete with in terms of like card slots when you're looking at building a deck. So I don't know if this actually makes a cut, but it's just a great Vortex evolution. Replaces the bait that you put into it. You can even build like just combo decks around it, or not necessarily combo decks, but you can build like synergy decks, like where you're playing Titan Caller to find General Marnick, and then you can use Marnick to try to drop a giant creature like a Haven into play or something. Like you can just build super dense decks, like I filled with giant bomb creatures, and try to just abuse this card. So there's a lot of different ways to play it, and I think it's one of the cooler cards of the multi-civs. Like of these multi-civ vortexes, Marnick's one of the more intriguing ones to try to build around and break. Titan Caller, this card as well, I just talked about it. I think this card does double duty, where it's just like an incredibly above rate, like low drop creature. Like just the opportunity to have like a 3 mana 2000 power +1 is just super strong. being able to dig for specific 6,000 power or more creatures is really appealing as well, which is what I sort of talked about in the nature review as the strength of this card. Unfortunately, I don't know if it really makes the cut in a lot of other decks. Like, of course, Megabugs is built around Marnick, and this card doesn't really do that as well for like just a straight up light water nature tempo deck. Like if you forego Megabugs, like you're still like the top end is going to be Lyra, which is nice. Maybe you could even find Blinder Beetle Prime, but you're just not going to have enough hits in those kind of decks, and like it doesn't hit Finbar, so like it just, I don't know where it exactly fits. Even in Mono Nature midrange, I talked about how I dissected that situation a lot too, where I feel like it's kind of like the fourth best 3-drop behind Turnip, Jarbala Hatchery, and even Sunclan Tortoise, where I felt like Sunclan Tortoise being like maybe 20% higher to hit the card, to get you the card off of it, even in Mono Nature where you have like 12 things. I haven't run the numbers in a while, so I don't remember them exactly off the top of my head, but like let's just say Titan Caller 70% and Sunclan Tortoise is like 90% to draw the card. Like I'd much rather take that extra 20%, because like there's so many evolutions in Mono Nature. Like you're usually going to have one, you can hold on to one and play towards it, and then at that point all you really want is like the +1 bait creature, so you can find a land drop so that you can play to that plan that's in your hand already. Whereas Titan Caller is much more about, like, you're not just looking for the simple +1, you're more so like digging for that powerful card to begin with, right? You're digging for that 6,000 power creature so you can find it, and because that card is like already part of your game plan, whether or not it's in your hand or not. So that's why I think Titan Caller is like really suited to that kind of Marnick style deck that I was just talking about, where you're looking for an incredibly specific card to where that's a core part of your game plan. Because Sunclan Tortoise just does a better job at just getting you the extra resources to just develop your hand and play towards the strengths of what your hand is already accomplishing. So I don't know if this really ends up finding a home, but just those two cards already, Sunclan Tortoise and Manitic, they've just proven to be really valuable early drop creatures, and Titan Caller just slots into that sphere just as well. So I don't know the perfect home for it, but I think this card itself just has a lot of strength, and not the worst even if you whiff, because like it's just a creature in play that you could evolve on. So not the worst card, and definitely super powerful. Next up, Guacamole Gunner. Just amazing shield blast, or not amazing, but just another great nature shield blast. It could let you could throw it into Mono Nature, and then you can double your shield count, so you can have, or shield blast, or defensive shield blast at least. You might still be playing Crick Ants and Horned Chameleons or whatever, but being able to add this alongside Sumo Artichoke just gives you an extra layer of defense. Blasting out creatures and that versatility is always amazing. Joko's like a pretty solid shield blast, so this one's going to be a really solid shield blast as well. This one has like the benefit of like being able to, like, you can almost stop the veggie combo with this, like through a Swift Regeneration, because you can like root trap the cornucopia if they leave it untapped. But I mean, they can play around that by not attacking with it, but there are like niche cases where like banishing, or by putting stuff in your opponent's mana zone is like better than killing stuff. I guess in that case you could like you could throw like the Steam Tank or whatever fast attack creature, you could throw that in their mana zone instead. So I don't know, if your opponent's playing Guacamole Gunner and you're playing wild veggies, maybe it's worth maybe it's something that's an interaction to keep in mind, is like making sure you play around Guacamole Gunner and attacking with your fast attack giving stuff first. So if anyone's out there listening, that could be a pro tip. But at least when you're under Swift Regeneration, where you might otherwise kind of dismiss that stuff because you're not worried about your stuff dying or anything like that. But this card is also great for veggies itself. I mean, just having an extra Shield Blast creature, and I've always talked about how like being able to blast out a wild veggie is so insane when you can follow it up with a cornucopia from hand, or follow it up with a bad apple from hand, and then immediately use that body for a lot more than just its body. Now it's also like generating advantage. It's developing your board presence, because like imagine like your opponent just breaks a shield, they chip in for a shield, hit a Guacamole Gunner, you could just choose not to kill their guy, and instead you just untap, play cornucopia, summon out like a ninja pumpkin, and now your board's like super wide. And like Guacamole Gunner's like 4,000 power, so like blasting out a 4,000 power creature is also like really strong. So I love the decks that this card. I'm a huge fan of the Veggie deck and a huge fan of the Mono Nature deck. Two of my favorite decks to play. Actually, like the Veggie deck has really grown on me. Mono Nature over the past year especially has been like a deck I've like really grown to love, like learning to sequence with and play with. So Guacamole Gunner I think is like an awesome addition or potential addition at the very least to some of those decks. Darkwood Tribe, I kind of went off on this card in the multi-civ video. This card is just something, the more I thought about it, the more amazing I think it is. Um, I hesitate to say that because I could totally flop on this card, but I think it just does so much as like it's one of the cheaper effects, and it has a 3,000 power like out of the pile control decks, because like there are fire cards that have this kind of effect that deal with small creatures, right? But the problem is fire sucks. So having that kind of effect on a dark nature card that you can throw in your pile control deck is like amazing. Having a dark nature mana card that can unlock nature so you can consistently cast your like sprouts and reap and sows is amazing. Having this a way to deal with cyber scamps so you can unlock the spells in your hand is amazing. So I feel like this card just solves a ton of problems with the pile deck. You can also like it's just so backbreaking against, like, if you're going first against rush, like you just blow up their 2-drop. Like, oh my gosh, it's so good. Like, it just can win the game on the spot if you just kill their 2-drop. Like with this card, they have no board presence going into turn 3, and then they just play Jethro Starter, try to attack, and then you just kill the Jethro Starter with the Darkwood Tribe or something like that. Like, it's just so difficult. Like having 3,000 powers, a sizable body against those aggro decks, picking off creatures, whether it be Magris or Cyberscamp or Blaze Belchers or Cliff Cutters or whatever the heck people are playing as their bait creatures, like Cyber Traders. Like, it's just so strong, in my view, especially like so much better than things like Screeching Scaradorable. Like, Screeching is an amazing card too, and a card that's been teched into pile as well. Like, but that card, like, you don't necessarily need to worry about killing stuff like Strider. And like, sure, Screeching can kill stuff like Lux, and it can kill things that are maybe a bit bigger, like it can kill Metamaxes and weaponized Razor Cats, but Darkwood Tribe can kill Nyx, and it can kill other stuff too. Like, I just think this card's awesome, and like 3 mana is so much stronger than Screeching, and on top of that all, it has the duality of being a ramp card. Now, it's not a true ramp card because it doesn't actually generate the extra resource to put into your mana zone, but it does, like, it's still a ramp card because if you generate a bunch of cards and extra cards in your hand, like, all you're doing is switching a card from your hand to your mana zone. You're just changing that resource. You're not generating extra resources. But if you're playing Reverberates in those control matchups where you might want this as a ramp card, you can just, like, those extra resources can just, like, you don't run out of resources. So, like, the extra resources you wouldn't have otherwise used just end up in your mana zone off Darkwood Tribe, and it's like basically a true ramp effect at that point. And it basically generates that extra ramp resource. Or if you're playing against an aggro deck and they don't have any targets, you can still play a cheap 3 mana 3,000 body to contest the board while also ramping. And then again, if they're attacking and breaking your shields, you're going to end up with a bunch of extra cards in hand. Whatever dead cards you can't use, you can just turn those into resources and generate virtual card advantage that way, because now, like, you've turned this blank in your hand into an extra mana. So, like, I think this card's awesome in a ton of different matchups. Gives you a little bit more ramp cards for, like, the slower matchups, give you a little bit more interaction for the cheap matchups, and, like, the big thing is creature-based interaction. I think this card's amazing. One of the cards I've talked myself into a lot. Maybe overstated. To be honest, I could be overstating this, but I like this card a lot. One of my favorites. Justicar Arcanix. I've gone into depth on this card already, but just an awesome, really cool build around. Builds its own sort of archetypes. Not sure how playable it is on the whole, but a really sweet card for sure. Finbar, kind of same deal. Builds its own archetypes. Not sure how good those would be. Like, I don't think, like, the blocker decks are really going to be competitive decks in the overall sphere, right? But I mean, Finbar itself, like, the fact that it builds its own archetype is just really sweet. So I mean, or at least improves like the Panopter decks to like a place where they're like more competitive at the very least. King Arborious, probably my favorite of the Vortex evolutions. Just 5 mana, dodging Bone Blades, 9,000 power, absolutely massive. Um, and just having the ability to ideally drop like a ton of mana worth of cards into the play, and like whether it be Lyras or Finbars or what have you, like just being able to go super wide, um, I think could slot in. Now I don't know if it's actually good enough. It might be just worse. Like I've played builds of Lightwater Nature and decks like that where I've played a couple Anjacs, and I think that's been totally fine, but I don't know if that's the best way. Like it's generally better, I think, to play Blinder Beetle Primes in that slot than Anjacs, in my experience. Like if I'm playing just Bant tempo, like I'd rather just play Blinder Beetle Primes plus Finbars and maybe Lyras, maybe not Lyras. If I'm playing Lightwater Nature Megabugs, obviously this card's not really going to fit into that as well. So you would have to rebuild in favor of Arborious maybe over Megabugs. Like maybe that's where it is. It's like rather than play bugs, you can play Arborious. So maybe that's the kind of thing. Maybe that's the deck that wants Titan Caller a little bit more. Because Titan Caller can find the Arborious and also find you the 6-drop, 6k having power creatures so that you can drop them into play with Arborious. So maybe that's the approach you would want to go. But I think there's like definitely an area for this card to see play. But maybe at the end of the day, it's just a little more inconsistent than just slotting in a couple Anjacs if you want this big mid-rangey evolution rather than just playing this. Because Anjac, though it doesn't generate the extra board presence at the same time, so you can't have Arborious plus like a 6-drop, like Anjac still generates extra board presence when it leaves the battle zone. So if your opponent has to deal with it, which they generally do because it's a giant Evo slapping them in the face, then Anjac buys you back some board presence. So I think, I'm not sure if this will end up making the cut at the end of the day, but definitely a card I would give a shot to, and it looks like one of the more powerful of these cards. And the final card, this is a card I think is just the best card in the set overall, is just Vang. I've talked about this card as well, just can go into practically anything. It's like a mid-range card. It could be the top end, similar to Lyra functions in a lot of these aggressive or like more beat down, like what we call tempo decks. Like it could be the top end of that. It could also be like a card used alongside Agrics where you fill your graveyard, rebuy it out of your graveyard, or even just trade it off early and then like you trade off with like a roll core with it after picking off an evolution or picking off some other bait and then bring it back a couple turns down the road with, or like the next turn even with Agrics and pick off more creatures. Like, yeah, this card is awesome. I think just one of the standalone best cards in the set. Easy like I could easily see just slotting this into pile control as well. Just maybe like you take a turn off to, like maybe you even in the face of a Cyrus Camp, you just reap and sow, let them go wide, and then spike your Clash. Maybe that's not worth doing, but like, yeah, it's just, this card's just awesome. So this card I would say is the best card in the set. And then, yeah, just a bunch of cool build arounds, some cards worth playing. Darkwood Tribe has my heart, and yeah, overall, like a pretty strong or a pretty decent set. Like got a bunch of good cards worth thinking about, and there are plenty of other cards. Like there's other multi-civs that are really good. Like I said, I left off a bunch of the other Vortex evolutions. Like the Mammoth is probably not that great, but at least one of the more powerful ones. Rammus is like a really cool build around, but I don't really think the decks that play Rammus are really going to get there. The Alcadius is just like a really strong card in a good color combination, so that card would probably be on there if I was just doing straight power level, but it's not one of my favorite cards in the set in terms of what I would want to build around, which is what a lot of these cards are. And these are all like just really intriguing cards to me and cards I would most want to explore. And a little bit of that is mixed in with like what I think are like some of the more powerful cards too. But whereas Alcadius just looks a little bit, to be honest, it just looks a little bit boring to me. I'm not the most interested by it. So maybe Tatsurian could be on this list as well. I don't know. Like it's another build around similar to Arcanix and Finbar. So yeah, just plenty of good cards. Like even Cryptic Worm or that's not the name of it, Cloud Worm, whatever, the light dark worm multi-civ that taps and or could get back a creature from your discard pile, that card's fine. The Firelight Legionnaire that either has fast attack or untap something, like that card is like a pretty strong card, but I don't know if it actually makes the cut in Firelight, so I didn't want to put it on this list because I don't even know if it's a card I'm going to see play or put in a deck that it's meant to be put in. So yeah, plenty of just fine cards and tons of cards worth considering in this set. All the good 2-drops too. So overall, really cool set. Something I'm excited to play a little bit more with down the road. I haven't played a ton with everything. Like a lot of the vortexes I haven't done a little bit of, too much experimenting with, mostly just like Marnick, and played a bit with Ramus and some of these other cards, but would be really cool to delve into playing with cards like Darkwood Tribe and Guacamole Gunner, Titan Caller, like a lot of the more niche stuff I haven't even Vang I haven't really played too much with either, so it would be really cool to start playing with more of these cards in the future. So if anyone has any thoughts on any of these cards, has their own opinion on what they think the best cards in the set are, as always, let me know your thoughts on Eye of the Storm as a whole. Let me know if you enjoyed the video series, maybe what other series or videos you'd like to see in the future. As always, thank you for watching. I hope you enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.